On set with us here is Professor Zvi Shiller, General Chair of the Israeli Robotics Association. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, tell us about China's interest in Israeli robotics.
So China is very much interested in robotics recently because they are embarking on actually upgrading their manufacturing capabilities, and robotics is one way to do that. And they are interested actually in Israeli robotics because they know of our abilities in high-tech, and they expect us to help them in advancing their robotics capabilities as well.
Will you talk a bit about a promise of a robotics revolution, that this potentially could be the next tech revolution after the internet?
In fact, we are just coming out of the internet revolution that has lasted for about the last 25 years. And we are entering into a new era, which I would call the robotics revolution. And what it does, it builds up on the previous technologies, which are internet, communication, software. And now what we are doing is we are adding hardware to all of this software. So adding hardware to software, that basically makes a robot. And we are now at the beginning of this revolution. Now that revolution actually has lasted for the last 30 years. The new thing is that now we are developing now consumer products that are robotic. One example is, for example, the Roomba vacuum cleaner. That's a robot that entered the home, in about 13 years ago. And I'm expecting more and more such devices to enter the house.
It's essentially an extension of the Internet of Things.
Exactly it. So the Internet of Things is actually the first step on making things like robots connected to the internet and communicating with each other, communicating with the world, getting commands from the users, and actually doing things that are smarter than the previous machines have been doing.
Right, but when you project this new revolution, this robotics revolution, how will it really be different from the other ones?
The robotics revolution will be different from the previous one because, first of all, there will be hardware involved, as previously it was only software. For example, in the software revolution, let's call it that way, 3 guys, kids, in their parents' living room could have started a new company. So they had an idea, they programmed it, and they could actually start something like Facebook. That doesn't happen in robotics. Robotics, the development cycle is much longer, much more difficult, is multidisciplinary. You have to know not only software and programming, you have to know hardware, you have to know vision, you have to know sensing, you have to know control, and it's so complicated that actually most startups most startups actually takes them about 10 to 15 years to actually see a profit. And we have several examples of such companies in Israel that they have started in the early 2000s, and they are still struggling to make a profit. Very strong companies, I don't want to mention names, very strong companies, some of them even are public companies, but they are still struggling to make a profit because this is a very difficult area to develop in.
Right, and as you mentioned, compare it to the startups that sometimes take just a couple years to turn out a profit. Here, this development cycle is much, much longer, and so it's even harder to attract investment. But what can the companies do to be more attractive to VCs?
So that's a good question, because that's the $100 or $1,000 question, which is, okay, it's so difficult. There are several market failures that we have to overcome. If we recognize those, there are 2 things we can realize, or we can come up with. One is that instead of thinking of this ideal robot, like a humanoid that will do everything in the house, we have to break down the task that we expect of that robot to do to smaller tasks and build specific robotic system for these smaller tasks. That's one way of doing it. The other one is that if we do still want to develop a large robot, a sophisticated one, so we may expect only a large company to do that, like the Israeli aircraft industry that is developing a giant robot that is pulling airplanes from the gate to the runway. But still, the development cycle is still very long, but they can sustain it, and they can tolerate, or they can actually do it in a longer time on their own money. Small startups, they cannot survive more than 1 or 2 years before they actually see that products materializing.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Zvi Shiller.
Thank you very much for having me.